Hi, class. In my last lecture, I talked about a number of Poe's poems. In this one, I'm going to talk about only one poem, his most famous one, probably what he's best known for today. Contrary to popular assumptions, Poe didn't write The Raven in response to his wife Virginia's death. They were living in New York at the time, and although she was in poor health, she lived for another 2 years after the poem appeared in print. They rented rooms on the second floor of a farmhouse overlooking the Hudson River. At the time, this photo was taken shortly before the building's demolition in 1888. It was no longer a residence. After it was torn down, the rock was blasted out and the ground leveled for urban development, and not much of this original landscape is left on Manhattan today. Some of it can still be seen in Central Park. Exactly when and where The Raven first appeared in print is debatable, but in 1845, Poe sold the poem to the American Review, where it appeared in the February issue. Apparently, for reasons that may have something to do with Poe's literary reputation in the Northeast at this time, he withheld his identity, as you can see here, but probably helped compose the introductory note directing attention to the poem's complicated prosody, with a sly rebuke of New England readers and poetasters. There's an excerpt there on the left. The resources of English rhythm for varieties of melody, measure, and sound, producing corresponding diversities of effect, have been thoroughly studied, much more perceived by very few poets in the language. We could wish the capacities of our noble language in prosody were better understood. Seemingly changes his mind about the poem's anonymity in the American Review, he rushed to have the poem printed in the New York Evening Mirror. This was a newspaper with which he was involved at the time, taking credit for it this time in a short note at the head of the poem. We are permitted to copy in advance of publication from the second number of the American Review the following remarkable poem by Edgar Poe. It will stick to the memory of everybody who reads it. The necessity of cramming the poem's long lines into a single column of newsprint makes this the most hideous of the early printings of the poem. Another important early version, with slight edits, appeared in the Broadway Journal, not long after its debut in the American Review. The printing is not quite as handsome as the American Review, but not so bad as the Evening Mirror either. Only one of the poem's 108 lines did not fit neatly in the right-hand column of the page, which is the third line of stanza 14. So these are some of the early important printings of the poem. I'm going to talk next about the poem as a piece of literary art. And to make that task easier, I'm going to use Poe's essay, The Philosophy of Composition, as a kind of outline. A year after The Raven's appearance in February 1845, it was still immensely popular with readers and had appeared in countless newspapers and magazines across the country. Poe wrote The Philosophy of Composition for Graham's Magazine in response to the attention and celebrity the poem had brought him, which accounts, I think, for the occasional facetiousness and somewhat arch tone throughout the essay. Despite this, his key points are quite valid and in the main consistent with his more serious literary criticism, and I'm going to use several of these points to guide my remarks on the poem. There'll be 6. I'm going to list them on the left of the screen. Unity of impression, pleasure, tone, the refrain, the raven, and finally, prosody. I'm going to start with unity of impression. Poe uses the words impression and effect interchangeably because the effects of poetry are, by his definition, more intense than other modes of literary expression. The poet must limit the individual poem to just one impression. Too many impressions, he implies, will exasperate and exhaust the reader. Once the poet has committed to an effect, he must sustain it to the very end. And for this reason, Poe says, poems should be short in length. If a poem requires more than one sitting to finish reading it, the unity and intensity of effect is lost. The extent of a poem may be made to bear mathematical relation to its merit, he says. In other words, to the degree of the true poetical effect which it is capable of inducing, for it is clear that the brevity must be in direct ratio of the intensity of the intended effect. For this reason, Poe says he limited The Raven to 108 lines, divided into 18 stanzas of 6 lines each. And I'll have more to say about the structure of the poem later. Moving on now to Pleasure. In Poe's 1842 review of Longfellow and the Poetic Principle, and I talk more about both these important articles in another lecture, he argues that pleasure is the only legitimate purpose of poetry, and moreover, that beauty is the source of the highest form of pleasure. And he repeats this fundamental postulate in the philosophy of composition as well. That pleasure which is at once the most intense, the most elevating, and the most pure is, I believe, found in the contemplation of the beautiful. When, indeed, men speak of beauty, they mean precisely not a quality as is supposed, but an effect. They refer, in short, just to that intense and pure elevation of soul, not of intellect or of heart. It is important to emphasize here the quasi-spiritual pleasure of beauty, which Poe believes elevates us above mere physical delight, mental equanimity, or the grosser sensual appetites. Elsewhere, he suggests that the beauty of woman is the highest form of beauty, and the love she inspires the most beautiful of human sentiments. And yet, perhaps because of our earthly limitations, our existence separate from the ideal, he insists that this pleasure is always strongest when it's tinged with sorrow, with melancholy. The tone of beauty's highest manifestation, he writes, is one of sadness. Beauty of whatever kind, in its supreme development, invariably excites the sensitive soul to tears. And this axiom, he explains, is how he arrived at the topic for The Raven, the topic of mournful and never-ending remembrance. I asked myself, of all melancholy topics, what, according to the universal understanding of mankind, is the most melancholy? Death was the obvious reply. And when, I said, is this most melancholy of topics most poetical? The answer here also is obvious, when it most closely allies itself to beauty. The death, then, of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world, and equally is it beyond doubt that the lips best suited for such topic are those of a bereaved lover. Moving on now to the refrain. To sustain the Raven's unity of mournful impression, that mournful and never-ending remembrance, Poe landed on the idea of a refrain, what he calls a keynote in the construction of the poem, some pivot upon which the whole structure might turn. The pleasure of this keynote, like that of musical composition, is deduced solely from the sense of identity, he says, of repetition. Here's his explanation for how he arrived at the word nevermore. Having made up my mind to a refrain, the division of the poem into stanzas was, of course, a corollary, the refrain forming the close to each stanza. That such a close, to have force, must be sonorous and susceptible of protracted emphasis, admitted, no doubt, and these considerations inevitably led me to the long O as the most sonorous vowel, in connection with R as the most producible consonant. The sound of the refrain being thus determined, it became necessary to select a word embodying this sound, and at the same time in the fullest possible keeping with that melancholy which I had predetermined as the tone of the poem. In such a search it would have been absolutely impossible to overlook the word nevermore. In fact, It was the very first which presented itself. Looking then at the poem, and I'm showing it as printed in the Broadway Journal so that we can see it in its entirety, we see that there are actually 2 refrains. Of the first 7 stanzas, 6 end with the 2-word refrain, nothing more. Stanza 2 is the lone outlier in the entire poem. It is not until the raven speaks in stanza 8 that we get the keynote of Nevermore, which appears in the next 10 stanzas consecutively. And in this version, it appears twice in stanza 11. Poe repeatedly fiddled with the refrain of stanza 11. In most instances, it is the raven speaking the word, although Poe fiddled with this too, and initially the speaker is bemused by it, but stanza 13 marks a noticeable turning point in the poem. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Here the speaker turns from speculating about the bird's origin and how the word nevermore may have been introduced into its avian vocabulary by its owner, he turns now to a reminder of the loss of his beloved Lenore, much like the speaker of Ulalume, who wanders through the night, stargazing until he unwittingly finds himself at the tomb of Ulalume. And in this instance, in this stanza, the refrain clearly is not spoken aloud by the raven, but rather is part of the speaker's interior monologue. And this doesn't happen again until the last stanza of the poem. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. So moving on now to the topic of the raven. The nevermore refrain appears 12 times, 11 in earlier versions of the poem, 11 and a half in the 1845 collection of Poe's poems. And in most instances, as I said before, it is spoken by the raven, who says no other word in the entire poem unless it repeats the speaker's whispered utterance of Lenore in the 5th stanza. In the philosophy of composition, Poe addresses the challenge of devising a plausible reason for the continuous repetition of nevermore, of reconciling the monotony with the exercise of reason on the part of the creature repeating the word. Here then immediately arose the idea of a non-reasoning creature capable of speech, and very naturally a parrot in the first instance suggested itself, but was superseded forthwith by a raven, as equally capable of speech and infinitely more in keeping with the intended tone. In addition, there are literary precedents for a talking raven, none more influential perhaps than Charles Dickens's novel Barnaby Rudge, which Poe had reviewed for Graham's magazine in February 1842. The titular character Barnaby keeps a talking pet raven named Grip, which follows him everywhere. At one point, while visiting a graveyard, the bird hops from gravestone to gravestone, and sometimes, and I'm quoting from the novel here, sometimes after a long inspection of an epitaph, he would strop his beak upon the grave to which it referred and cry in his hoarse tones, "I'm a devil, I'm a devil." Dickens himself owned a pet raven, also named Grip, and likewise a talented mimic of the English language. In 1841, it died of lead poisoning after eating paint, and Dickens, grieving over his lost pet, had it stuffed and would keep it in his study for the rest of his life. And the bird still exists, remarkably well preserved, and it now resides in the Philadelphia Free Library. In his review of Dickens's novel, Poe lamented that Grip didn't play a larger role. Its croakings, he opined, might have been prophetically heard in the course of the drama. Its character might have performed, in regard to that of Barnaby, much the same part as does in music the accompaniment in respect to the air. What Dickens's Raven lacks, therefore, are the prophetic and musical qualities that Poe's Raven possesses in abundance. A month after penning his review of Barnaby Rudge, Poe managed to meet with Dickens in Philadelphia, and one imagines their conversation at some point turned to talking birds. It may have been more than just admiration and professional respect then, when several years later Poe began his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, with an anecdote about Dickens. Finally, I'm going to talk about prosody. The meter and rhyme of The Raven were heavily influenced by British poet Elizabeth Barrett, whose two-volume collection of poems, A Drama of Exile and Other Poems, was reviewed by Poe for the Broadway Journal in January 1845, the same month he published The Raven. Specifically, her poem Lady Geraldine's Courtship drew his notice. Although its subject matter has little in common with Poe's poem, it provided him with an example of trochaic octameter with alternating catalectic and acatalectic lines, and I'll explain this in greater detail a little bit later. When Poe's collection, The Raven and Other Poems, appeared in late 1845, it included a dedication page addressed to Elizabeth Barrett. She was apparently appreciative of his efforts to promote her work in America and later sent him a letter praising The Raven, which she tells him, and I'm quoting her here, has produced a sensation, a fit of horror here in England. Some of my friends are taken by the fear of it, and some by the music. I hear of persons haunted by the refrain, nevermore. Poe would have enjoyed reading that last sentence especially. Finally, I'm going to talk in more specific terms about the poem's complex meter and rhyme. I have chosen stanza 7 for no other reason than this is the point where the bird first barges into the speaker's study. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not an instant stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. The disyllabic metrical foot that Poe employs consistently throughout the poem is a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. In other words, the first syllable, typically the longer syllable, is naturally pronounced with greater emphasis than the shorter one. So I'll take a look at the first word of the first line. Just open. I've highlighted the stressed syllable and the unstressed syllable. And this two-syllable pattern is called a trochee. Reading the entire line in a natural voice, then, we can plainly hear 7 more trochees. And I'll highlight the stress syllables of each one. We have here, flung, shut, when, men, and actually that the Y of many and the A actually combined together, not counted as 2 syllables. Flirt and flut and flutter. And I'm going to highlight the last unstressed syllable of that trochee for reasons that I will explain in just a few minutes. So altogether then, there are 8 metrical feet in this line, or 8 trochees, and I've numbered them there for you. So we can say the line is composed in trochaic octameter. That is a line of 8 consecutive trochees. The first 5 lines of this 6-line stanza are written in trochaic octameter. However, only lines 1 and 3, the only unrhymed lines, end with a complete trochee, that is, with a stressed followed by an unstressed syllable. So what's going on in the other lines then? Lines 2, 4, and 5 are also trochaic octameter. I'll highlight the first 7 feet of line 2, just the stressed syllables. However, Poe dropped the unstressed syllable from the 8th trochee, the last one, so the line ends on a stressed syllable, your. This makes what is called a catalectic line. And basically a catalectic here is a half trochee. Lines 4 and 5 are also catalectic, which Poe did to emphasize the most important rhyming sound in the poem, and we'll talk about its rhyme pattern in a moment. I'd like you to pause the video now and read the 6th line, the last line of this stanza, to yourself. How many trochees does it have? Are the trochees complete, as in lines 1 and 3, or is this line catalectic like lines 2, 4, and 5? Okay, so there are 4 stressed syllables. We'll call it 4 trochees. So it is trochaic tetrameter, and because there's no unstressed syllable at the end, it is catalectic. Finally, I want to say a few words about the poem's rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern. It's important to remember the emphasis Poe places on the refrain of nothing more, which after this stanza, stanza 7, changes to nevermore and stays that way for the rest of the poem. It's the most important note in The Raven, and to make it resonate, Poe needed lines to rhyme with it. So he rhymes lines 2, 4, and 5, the catalectic lines, with more in the refrain. In line 2, then, we have the word your. Lines 4 and 5 in all 18 stanzas end with identical rhymes. In this example, door and door. In fact, door is the most common rhyming word in the poem, followed by Lenore. As you can see, he uses 17 different words to rhyme the refrain. Let's look now at the acatalectic lines, lines 1 and 3, which end with flutter and stayed he. These lines use internal rhyme to enhance the metrical effects. In both cases, the last trochee rhymes with the 4th metrical foot in the line. So flutter rhymes with shudder, and stayed he rhymes with made he. For an additional complication, Poe extends the internal rhyme of line 3 into line 4. So in addition to stayed he and made he, the 4th foot of line 4 reads lady. And he does this consistently throughout the poem. Another sound effect Poe uses is alliteration, the repetition of initial consonant sounds. There's the thrice repeated FL sound of flung, flirt, and flutter in line 1, and the rapid succession of ST sounds in line 3. Poe uses alliterative effects in nearly every line. You can point to any random line in the poem, and it's likely you will find some form of alliteration. So I'm going to end with that. For class discussion, I want you to consider whether The Raven is in fact as unified as Poe claims it is in the philosophy of composition, and in what ways it satisfies Poe's broader objectives for poetry as he presents them in The Poetic Principle and practiced in the other poems we've read.